Okay, so our last speaker of the day is Donovan Irven. Donovan, I don't have the title of your paper.
Schizoanalysis and Modernist Refutations of Freud.
Schizoanalysis and Modernist Refutations of Freud is Donovan's paper. So Donovan was born in Cumberland, Maryland, a small working class town in the Appalachians. He studied philosophy, history, and creative writing at Frostburg State. Received his master's degree in philosophy from Westchester University in Pennsylvania, and is currently a PhD candidate in the philosophy and literature interdisciplinary program at Purdue, which I've probably said to death at this point. An APPA certified philosophical counselor, Donovan is the author of several books of both fiction and philosophical essays, the most recent of which is titled Things in Brown Paper. He is the recipient of numerous awards in philosophy, including the 2008 Claghorn Award, and a full scholarship to study the relationship between analytic and continental philosophy at the Université Paris-Ouest in the summer of 2015.
Welcome. Okay, so just a quick note, I want to give people a kind of heads up before I start. I'm going to talk a little bit about Faulkner and the kind of subject forces me to confront some of Faulkner's racial language. So I've kept utterances of epithets to a complete necessary minimum, but I do want to give people sort of heads up that we do have to confront some of this uncomfortable language. Okay, so the influence of Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytic theory on literature is undeniable. I mean, we know the oft-repeated observation that modernist novels sometimes read like psychoanalytic case studies. One of my advisors, John Duvall, continuously reminds me of this. But this observation is, in my view, a bit overstated, and may, in fact, be an obstacle to the development of more philosophically oriented approaches to the study of fiction. While it's not contentious that modernist novelists were almost universally familiar with Freud's theories of the unconsciousness and sexuality, I want to argue that modernist novels often contain critiques of psychoanalytic theories and in many ways prefigure the critical work performed by philosophers such as Deleuze and Guattari, and perhaps surprisingly, Martin Heidegger. So this is really like what I'm working on here, is that some of this so-called postmodern, post-structural philosophy is already found within modernist literature, and it's just we have to make it explicit where it's implicit. So first, let's be clear where and when Freud's theories provide an effective hermeneutic tool. Perhaps the best place for me to start is William Faulkner, and Faulkner's incomparable treatment of psychosexual trauma in the early childhood of Joe Christmas, which we find in Light and August. Beginning in chapter 6 and unfolding throughout the next 167 pages, Faulkner recounts the traumatic upbringing of Joe Christmas, an orphan boy of questionable, possibly mixed racial status. Although the full details of his racial heritage are never fully disclosed with any certainty, the evidence suggests that Christmas could be racially mixed, but appears white enough to pass into Southern society. In order for a psychoanalysis of Christmas to work, it must be assumed that many of the events recounted in chapters 6 through 13 are repressed, thus becoming a part of his unconscious. Freud's distinction between the conscious and the unconscious is pretty straightforward, and in 1912 he explained, now let us call conscious the conception which is present to our consciousness and of which we are aware, and let this be the only meaning of the term conscious. As for latent conceptions, if we have any reason to suppose that they exist, as we had in the case of memory, let them be denoted by the term unconscious. Further, Freud makes a distinction between ego instincts and the libidinal sexual instincts, such that normal development results from harmony between these two. So this harmony. Neuroses arise from a conflict between the ego and sexuality, so a disharmony. The development of the ego and libidinal development take parallel courses, which display moments of correspondence, and neuroses, under Freud's view, come into existence when the ego adopts a non-compliant attitude to the libido's being settled at a certain stage of its development. And he provides a good overview of this in the 1915 introductory lectures on psychoanalysis. The libido becomes fixated or settled, that's not the genitals such as the mouth or anus. So let's apply this theoretical framework to Light and August. To quote Faulkner, memory believes before knowing remembers, believes longer than recollects, longer than knowing even wonders. And in that way, Faulkner introduces us to the psychosexual trauma of Joe Christmas. It is a statement of the unconscious and an indication of the coming repression by which he becomes fixated on oral eroticism. As a 6 or 7-year-old orphan, Joe Christmas sneaks into a room where he can indulge in the tasting of toothpaste, the flavor of which he quite enjoys. As he stuffs his mouth with toothpaste, the female dietitian of the orphanage enters the room with her lover. Faulkner tells us that part of the reason Christmas takes such pleasure from the toothpaste is not only its flavor, but also the fact that it belongs to this dietitian. Thus, we can interpret Christmas as partaking of the toothpaste as a substitute sexual act, with the tube of toothpaste acting as a surrogate lover from which he derives his full satisfaction. The child hides behind a screen, fearful of being caught where he should not be, and can see the woman's clothing drop to the floor around her ankles. He becomes increasingly excited, and as his excitement builds, he sucks down more and more of the toothpaste. His excitement becomes mixed with fear of being caught doing what he should not do, and to compound this confusion of fear and sexual arousal, Christmas also begins to feel ill from all the toothpaste he's eaten. Sickness, fear, and sexual arousal all come to an overwhelming confluence within the boy, and he vomits. Upon vomiting, he is discovered by the dietitian and her lover, which destroys any peace Christmas maybe could have had in the orphanage. If we interpret Christmas's vomit as an extension of his own body, as Freud would, then we can see that his being discovered by the dietitian and her lover is an exposure of his innermost being. He is laid bare in his sexual excitement, but also in his confusion, sickness, and suffering. To further complicate things, the dietitian reacts with real emotional violence toward Christmas when she discovers him. The woman, who so intrigued the young boy, pulls back the curtain and exposes him, her, quote, wild and disheveled hair, now very different from the neatly groomed hair that the boy normally associates with candy. Faulkner describes the dietitian's words, "You little rat," the thin, Freudian voice hissed, "you little rat spying on me, you little nigger bastard." With those words, the dietitian not only rejects Christmas's gift and repudiates his innermost being, but she once and for all ties the shame of race to his trauma. His ego now rebels not only against his libidinal fixation, but against his identification as a nigger bastard. He then, without knowing why, sets out to repudiate his own blackness at all costs while lashing out violently against women in authority. At this point, however coincidental Freud's theories appear alongside the story Faulkner tells, the Freudian analysis begins to break down. One way to expose the collapse of an otherwise convincing Freudian analysis of Joe Christmas is to focus on the issue of racial trauma over that of the psychosexual. For one, Freud has very little to say about race. Sandra L. Gilman's book, Freud, Race, and Gender, deals with Freud's own anxiety about anti-Semitism and the assertion that Jewish men are feminine. As a result of this worry, Gilman argues Freud projects his own insecurities onto others, predominantly onto women, but Freud himself has little to contribute to the conversation about race in the United States, and even less so about the American South, about which Faulkner was so concerned, and whose cultural historical contexts were kind of existentially alien to Freud. Thus, we can either read Faulkner as extending psychoanalytic theory in order to incorporate race, or we can infer a critique of psychoanalytic blind spot on the issue of race and the racialized elements of psychosexual trauma. I'm not really willing to speculate on Faulkner's intentions, and it seems likely that he himself may not have really meant to do either of those things. He claimed in a 1957 seminar at the University of Virginia that he had not consciously employed Freudian theories at all in his construction of Joe Christmas, that such relations were merely coincidental, though he says perhaps not accidental. But regardless of Faulkner's intentions and his conscious or unconscious association with Freud, the above analysis shows that certain modernist novels definitely lend themselves to psychoanalytic interpretation. Even if unintentional, modernist authors were conversant with psychoanalytic theories popular at the time. And we could go on analyzing Light and August in this way more. There's lots more there. However, becoming fixated on a Freudian analysis willfully covers over some other crucial aspects of Faulkner's novel, particularly this racial dynamic. It also serves to too easy a causal explanation, as if Christmas's detestable violence toward women would somehow make sense under the explanatory power of Freudian neurosis. As sympathetic as we feel for the abused orphan Joe Christmas, he's also truly detestable at times, and particularly in his treatment of women, from his adopted mother to his lovers, and of course the doomed Joanna Burton. I really don't think Christmas's misogyny has a good explanation, nor do I think that psychosexual trauma is sufficient to explain the cause of this behavior. And that's part of psychoanalysis' appeal, that it is causal, that it provides a causal explanation for why someone did the things they did, or in literature, why certain characters behave in the way they do. It provides a hermeneutic closure. Within the psychoanalytic framework, we can expose the neurosis, examine the trauma, and then neatly explain the narrative from front to back. It all makes sense, right? So if we move a little away from Freud, since I've sort of made that the focus of my Freudian analysis, I want to consider Italo Svevo's novel Zeno's Conscious. And I want to do that because it both moves us away from Freud, but does so by presenting a work that's in the form of a psychoanalytic case study, right? That's the structure of the novel. The novel's preface offers the first intimation that the view of psychoanalysis therein is of a critical nature. The preface is in the voice of the doctor, who's publishing Zeno's autobiography out of revenge because Zeno had, quote, suspended treatment just when things were going well, denying me the fruit of my long and painstaking analysis. Right away, the motives of the psychoanalyst in relation to the patient are suspect. The analyst is in it for profit, not only in terms of beneficial research, but monetary gain. The analyst must get paid after all. Explaining why he quit psychotherapy, Zeno, the titular character of Svevo's novel, confesses, quote, but now I know everything, namely that it was nothing but a foolish illusion and a trick designed to affect some hysterical old woman. How could I bear the company of that ridiculous old man with that eye that is meant to be penetrating, and that presumption that allows him to collect all the phenomena of this world within his great new theory? Zeno's anger is not that the therapy was ineffectual. On the contrary, he admits to feeling emotion that was one of the most profound I have ever felt in my whole life. And that's a quote upon the discovery of his edible drive. But what turns Zeno away is his doctor's claim that he is cured upon this discovery of the edible scene. Zeno does not feel cured, and feels himself worsening, his shame deepening as he attempts to stick with the re-education phase of his treatment. The doctor tells Zeno that he is, quote, like a convalescent who still wasn't accustomed to living without a fever. Therein lies the paradox of Zeno's namesake. His progress, his motion, from sickness to health, is an illusion. Readers with knowledge of Freud will find plenty of psychoanalytic theory at play in Svevo's novel. However, we should note that an ironic distance is established, first by the preface, casting the analyst in a suspicious light, and secondly by the nature of Zeno's self-interpretations. I don't want to suggest that Zeno is offering like this airtight refutation of Freud. That's not really what's happening here. But Zeno's self-interpretations, for instance, his interpretation of the dream about cannibalizing his mistress, whose wounds won't bleed, with the effect of injuring his wife and unborn, even unconceived child, it is significant that his interpretations are plausible ones. They cast doubt on the universal applicability of Freudian interpretations. As Brian Maloney rightly points out, quote, Svevo's hostility toward terrorismo ideologico of all-embracing philosophical systems, that's the end quote. This position allows him to adopt psychoanalysis to great literary effect, while simultaneously offering a critique of the theory. With Svevo's role as master of ironies in mind, we begin to see how he has used the form of the psychoanalytic case study to undermine the claims of psychoanalysis. Likewise, if we return to Faulkner, we might find a narrative landscape that far outstrips the abilities of Freudian analysis. So I have this idea of interpretive multiplicity or interpretive plurality, and it establishes the grounds on which modernists and prefigures criticism of psychoanalysis found in theorists such as Deleuze and Guattari. It is precisely the psychoanalytic tendency to capture everything that Svevo resistance terrorismo ideologico. In this resistance, some things are allowed to pass through, and some things are blocked or repressed. Right? So Freud yields great results when interpreting Faulkner, but only to a point, because the flow of Faulkner's narrative will inevitably outstrip the systematic nature of cannibalization. Joe Christmas is highly schizophrenic. Despite all his childhood psychosexual trauma, he defies strict psychoanalysis by its containment of multiple persons within one body, a body that in the end becomes a body without its organ. He passes for what he is, the passing for white, black man, orphan, orally fixated, woman, hater, lover, bastard. He is outside the flow of the economy, not black, not white, both black and white at different times, schizoid, uncapturable. He can only be destroyed. And all of this, of course, coincidental, but not accidental. Consider another work of multiplicity, James Joyce's Ulysses. The Circe episode offers itself up for the type of factional interpretation I've been driving at. Bloom's psychosexual issues are on display. We can easily read masochism into the passages where Bloom is put on an auction block. The mistress Beo says satirically, quote, by day you will souse and batter smelling underclothes, also when the ladies are unwell and swab out our latrines with dress pinned up and a dishcloth tied to your tail. Won't that be nice? He places a ruby ring on her finger. And there now, with this big ring I thee own, say thank you, mistress. To all of this humiliation, Bloom responds as he's told, thank you, mistress, all very much in line with masochism. Also incidentally in line with the stereotype of Jewish men as effeminate, one of Freud's anxieties if we follow Gilman's analysis. And yet Bloom resists this interpretation. He oscillates between masculine and feminine, supplicant and demander, seller and buyer of his own fate. He seeks a flight path away from one of these traps. He sometimes finds the path blocked, so he diverges again, takes another path, following a horizontal rhizomatic structure. The rhizome is important within Deleuzean schizoanalysis, and the most succinct definition of this structure is surely this one. Quote, a rhizome has no beginning or end. It is always in the middle, between things, interbeing, intermezzo. End quote. Bloom is a being in between, in transit, on a journey around Dublin. He functions under principles of connection and heterogeneity. He is somehow connected to every other character in Ulysses through the language of the text and symbols employed throughout the narrative. Yet, divided within himself, he is a substantive multiplicity. Like Joe Christmas, he is at once many things and also not these things. He is in flight, substantial, yet as in motion. Time disrupts the strict relation of identity between Bloom and any property with which he is identified. His over-signification marks his rupture. Bloom may be broken, he may be blocked, outwitted by his wife's lover, cuckolded, cast into despair by the death of his son, but he picks up again, reforming himself along the previous line, reinvigorated throughout the stylistically shifting narrative of the text. In a similar fashion, the narrative of Joe Christmas starts and stops. It breaks off and picks up again at an earlier date. It spirals around and doubles back on itself, rupturing the normal temporal flow of narrative as it chases down the schizoid character of Christmas across his various lines of flight until he is finally annihilated under the totalitarian structure of the racist state. I have returned to Faulkner not because I think a Deleuzean reading is better, because I think both Freud and Deleuze can be apt for the same text, just as a dialectic historical interpretation can help make sense of why I think such a thing. Freud introduced a groundbreaking theory of psychology. However, his theory has severe limitations, among them the crippling effect of being a product of a highly specialized focus on the sexuality of a specifically Victorian nature. I think Foucault as well as Deleuze is useful here. Nonetheless, in spite of whatever limitations are inherent in the system, it opened the door for modernist novelists to greatly enhance the nuance and subtlety of their depictions of the human psyche, even when they didn't purposefully or faithfully recreate Freudian models in their text. Happy coincidence of influence. One is not always aware of what influence are always already at work in creative undertakings. Unsurprisingly, then, philosophers and theoreticians take up theory and what has been alluded to in art. Modernist literature influenced in its turn a generation of thinkers, some of whom were interested in critiquing psychoanalysis. In response to the work of the modernist novel, postmodern philosophers developed new theoretical tools with which to perform interpretive analysis. A bit of a sidebar here. Strand and I were fortunate enough to take a class on Heidegger's Being in Time with Calvin and Schrag. Schrag was at Harvard in the late 50s, and at the same time that Derrida was a student there, and he talks about how Derrida would always read Ulysses. And of course, Deleuze went to very few conferences, and one of the prominent conferences he went to was a conference on James Joyce, so this connection is there also in the biography. So we should not be surprised when these tools developed in response to modernism and art can themselves be used, perhaps retrospectively or anachronistically, to effectively interpret the art that inspired him. The ongoing hermeneutic task, as Paul Ricoeur says, to, quote, ceaselessly reopen toward the being which has expressed this discourse, which linguistics, due to its method, never ceases to confine within the closed universe of signs and within the purely internal play of their mutual relations. In fact, we can see a prefiguration of the Deleuzean critique of psychoanalysis already in the work of Heidegger. In 1964, Heidegger had pointed out that, quote, with respect to what we consider to be real and actual, according to Freud, only that which can be explained in terms of psychological, unbroken causal relations between forces is actual and genuinely actual. This is a lecture to a group of psychiatrists in Sweden. It's published under the Zolokon lectures. He then goes on to ask, and this is not, I don't think he's being ironic here, why can't there be something real which is not susceptible to an exact measurement? Why not sorrow? For example, Heidegger is already sketching lines of flight away from Freudian analysis while still acknowledging the problems of human finitude Freud discusses as unconscious and repression. Heidegger maintained, quote, the human being's finitude consists in the fact that he is not able to express the presence of beings as a whole, as what has already been, and as what is still to come as an immediately given presence. So I want to close with these remarks on finitude. One of the tasks of psychoanalysis is to get the patient to speak, to say things about themselves, about their memories, conditions. Zeno's task was to journal, and he produces a book's worth of observations about himself, much to his analyst's chagrin. The extravagance of Joyce, or the temporal ruptures in Faulkner's narrative, allows their characters to maintain secrets and suppress memories under the sheer volume of words or the complexity of the narrative structure. Svevo critiques Freud with irony, and so we don't give a Freudian interpretation of Svevo, we understand Svevo in a critical relation to Freud. Joyce and Faulkner and many others may be interpreted with Freud or with Deleuze and Guattari. I think this really gets to what Matthew was talking about the mutual becoming, like where there's these two things going on. Modernists speak to us in a plurality of languages through a multitude of voices. Critics and scholars are held accountable for training themselves to hear each voice in their appropriate register and to unearth with their interpretations the truth appropriate to the tool used to recover it. This is because we are finite. But because we are finite, we return to the text again and again, each time in our finitude to take what we can and manage from a discrete encounter. The whole never comes into view on a given pass. The problem with Freud is one of overreach, of attempting to do far more than the theory permits. This is especially troublesome when Freud is applied to literature as an interpretive mechanism. With its emphasis on the causal explanation underlying human behavior, psychoanalysis tend to subvert the main thrust of literary modernism in particular, that is, the frailty, uncertainty, and mystery of human existence. Freud at best helps us get a grip on the symbolic order sometimes at work in a novel. At worst, Freud destroys the entire point of the novel itself, which is often to bring readers into a relationship with and recognition of their own precarious existence in the contingencies of culture and history. The basic existential elements at the core of modernism are covered over by Freud, and the very ambiguity upon which the art of fiction rests is erased by recourse to psychosexual causation hidden in a pocket of undiscovered consciousness, as if consciousness had hiding places, as if it were merely some spatial object. Psychoanalysis engages people in the production of words, of statements about themselves. To this end, it has engaged literary studies in an overproduction of interpretive statements that have had the effect of an attempt to noyer la poisson, as the French say. Noyer la poisson means to drown the fish. When we talk too much trying to prove the efficacy of our theories without really saying anything, the effect is that our audience becomes confused and the subject of our inquiry becomes obstructed. We have attempted to drown the fish. But the fish cannot be drowned no matter the volume of water. In the end, the audience will suspect they've somehow been duped, that the theory, despite all the fine words it produces, failed to explain what it promised. In the case of literature, what it promises to explain isn't there, and thus projects onto the text a subject in the theory's own image. The successful explanation of the imaginary subject is, then, the failure to maintain oneself in the mystery of the art, a failure to appreciate our own radical